Hi students, welcome to lesson number 15, Agrarian questions and the Agrarian economy. Let us start with the introduction. The history of agrarian development in countries like India, characterized by the persistence of mass poverty and increasing inequality in the countryside, with a large section of the population excluded from the growth spheres of economy and society. A majority of rural Indians remain engaged in the agriculture even as the contribution of agriculture to gross domestic product GDP falls. Agriculture in India has remained a low productivity, low income economic activity. Now, let us look into the objectives. The first objective is to examine the questions on agrarian system. Second one is to learn about the agrarian economy, and the third one is to study the explanations to the questions. The question of the loss of development of capitalism in agriculture, the relations between classes which arise on this basis and the class struggle connected with it. In developed capitalist countries, the agrarian question concerns the classes of capitalist agriculture under state monopoly capitalism and the paths of development of large scale agricultural production based on modern technology. The question concerns the paths and methods of the elimination of pre-capitalist, that is feudal, and in certain backward countries pre-feudal, as well as the relations of production in agriculture. The agrarian question is one of the basic tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, which is associated with the confiscation of all the landed property of the landlords. However, as historical experience shows, because of its class limitations, the bourgeois cannot finally resolve the agrarian question. The complete resolution of the agrarian question is possible only as a consequence of socialist revolution, which not only solves the problem of the expropriation of large landed property and the distribution of lands among peasants, but also creates the conditions for the socialist transformation of agriculture. The land question arises with the beginning of the social division of labor, the development of commercial exchange, and the division of society into classes. The development of class inequality led to the usurpation of landed property by the exploiting classes. By the start of the capitalist era, landed property had become concentrated in the hands of the feudal land owning class, which exploited the peasants through the extraction of land rent in its various forms, labor, payments in kind, and money. The transitional stage to capitalism in agriculture was marked by the decay of feudal landlord economy, the evolution of the peasantry's feudal dependence toward capitalist relations of production, and the spread of peasant land leasing. Peasant and bourgeois land ownership arose with the decay of feudal and pre-feudal land ownership. It formed the basis of small scale peasant and capitalist structures in agriculture. The formation of the capitalist structure usually proceeds in two ways, with the establishment of either large scale capitalist or kulak landed property. Capitalism arose and developed on the basis of the separation of the actual producer from ownership of the means of production, the forcible appropriation of the peasants' lands, and the transformation of the peasants into free proletarians on the one hand and the monopolization of ownership in the means of production by the capitalist class on the other. The continuing alienation of independent producer from the means of production is evident in capitalist countries today. Land is the primary means of production in agriculture. Peasants were robbed of their property and the greater part of the land was concentrated in the hands of capitalist enterprises, which constituted a small percentage of all farms. The mass of peasants were left with a negligible amount of land. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the rural population predominated in the majority of countries of the world. The growth of commercial agriculture and the appearance on development of capitalist relations are accompanied by the class differentiation. This leads to destruction of old patriarchal relations in the countryside and the creation of new social groups in the rural population, the rural bourgeois and the rural proletariat. A process of specialization in agriculture takes place. The demand for hired labor, tools and articles of personal usage produced by industry increases among the rural population. This broadens the internal market for capitalism in the area of agriculture. Capital utilizes not only purely capitalist but also pre-capitalist, the forms of exploitation. Feudal forms of exploitation were particularly widespread under capitalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The separation of the landowner from his land, the characteristic of capitalism, is achieved in two forms: mortgage indebtedness, that is the interest bearing loans, and the leasing system. Capital exploits the working peasants not only as a hired labor but also as a proprietor by extracting exorbitant rates for mortgages, rental payments and state taxes. Marx himself wrote that individual capitalists were exploiting peasants by mortgages and usury, while the capitalist class was exploiting them by state taxes. Capital exploits both the worker and the peasants. Hence, the interests of the peasants are irreconcilable contradiction to the interest of bourgeois and the peasants. Naturally, the leader under capitalism is the working class. The reviews set out to answer 5 questions. 1. The first relates to the nature of changes in India's agrarian economy under neoliberal globalization. Second, asks whether changes under global capitalism reflect a transition from a rural and semi-feudal economy to an urban and industrial capitalist economy. The third relates to the nature of agrarian transition and whether this transition conforms to the classical model. The fourth highlights regional diversity in terms of agrarian changes and development and documents the experiences and responses to the transition from different regions and states. The final question relates to the responses of various agrarian classes and interest groups to the transition. At a more general level, the volume engages with and responds to an important contemporary debate. According to Beers-Bisten polemic, successful national development has always been preceded by successful agrarian transition. In an analysis of agrarian transitions across different societies over the last 2 centuries, in which the agrarian question was resolved through various forms and degrees of agrarian transition, he points out that three general parts of agrarian transformation in backward societies. The transition to capitalist agriculture to be the most significant, the socialist path and the populist path. The classical processes of social class differentiation within the peasantry will create a dynamic and forward looking class of capitalist farmers. This class will be more productive and contribute to national capitalist development by supplying surplus to urban areas and developing a home market. Classical political economy viewed agriculture as important for capitalist transformation for various reasons. It was the sector that could supply surplus for urban capitalist industrialization and cheap wage goods for industrial workers. A population engaged in agriculture also expanded the home market for industrial goods. According to Bernstein, in an open economy, post-globalization, the import of goods and services including food grains has become easier with mobile capital providing support to industry. These processes have meant that global capitalist development can proceed without resolving the agrarian question at the national level. Bernstein distinguishes between what are called the agrarian question of capital and the agrarian question of labor. While the agrarian question of labor might still be of some analytical relevance for developing societies, the agrarian question of capital has ceased to be of any importance because of globalization and its associated processes. The agrarian question of capital has been bypassed in the national development project of backward societies. He suggests that under capitalist agriculture, people are capitalist farmers, petty commodity producers or laborers, and therefore, no transformation is possible. Secondly, in the classical agrarian transition process, the necessary linkage between agriculture and industry is forced to taken forward by the state. The post-globalization period, the state is either unwilling or unable to play this role. Capital is no longer constrained by national boundaries. The national industrial development cannot be separated from international capital and global commodity chains. Land reform as a means of uniting landless or small peasants against landlords is a strategy that has lost relevance as national capital no longer looks forward accumulation from below for its sustenance. The peasant question in contemporary Asia with reference to India, according to D. Narasimha Reddy, identifies two concerns related to the land to the tiller. First, the redistributive land reforms would allot some parcels of land to peasants, but not lead to any gain in productivity. The second concern relates to the availability of land for redistribution in India, a problem that some observers have raised. Regarding the first, while the agrarian question of capital may not be as significant as in the past, the argument can be countered for a social justice perspective. Reddy points out that sealing surplus land is only one type of land available and that it can be clubbed with cultivable government land and Bhudan land with government support. Utsa Patnaik, in a chapter titled Capitalist Trajectories of Global Interdependence and Welfare Outcomes, the lessons of history for the present, counters a number of inherited and widely held assumptions about the history of capitalist development in developed countries. One assumption expects developing countries to follow a process of development similar to developed countries. Another assumption states that primitive accumulation of capital involved displacement of peasants from their land, concentration of landed property through enclosures, and the absorption of the peasantry in more productive domestic industries. This capitalist transformation of agriculture created the conditions for domestic industrialization. Patnaik disputes the historical validity of both observations and argues that conditions in developing countries are different from those in undeveloped countries. The failure of the agricultural revolution in England, for instance, did not impact industrialization because of the presence of colonies. With the advent of neoliberals and global corporate interest in land and rural livelihoods, the agrarian question has become more important than ever. Now, let us look into the agrarian economy. To understand an agrarian economy, the agrarian society or agricultural society is any community whose economy is based on producing and maintaining crops and farmland. Another way to define an agrarian society is by seeing how much of a nation's total production is in agriculture. People sustain their life by growing crops and cash crops. Agrarian means associated with the land, but in fact, agrarian could be used as a synonym for the cultivation of land. A more modern way to refer to agrarianism is farming. Agrarian comes from the Latin word agrarius, which means of the land. The cultivation of land includes both raising livestock and growing crops. An agrarian economy is an economy that is dependent both on farming and the raising of animals. Agrarian economies are less prevalent in modern society. However, they are still needed because there would not be food availability in grocery stores without them. There must be sufficient factors for agrarian economy to work well. Sufficient factors might include the amount of available sunlight, rain, and any strategies to improve crops or produce more and the new animals during the breeding season. Also, for an agrarian culture to function, individuals within the society must be able to distribute resources effectively, such as spending the appropriate amount of time with crops and livestock to ensure the success of agrarian community. Now, let us study the characteristics of agrarian economy. 1. Land ownership is unbalanced. An agrarian community is not a community where everything is equally distributed. There are people that own the land and people that work the land. 2. Traditional gender roles are prevalent in an agrarian economy. The men are assigned to take care of the livestock and attend to the crops. The women are in charge of taking care of children. 3. In an agrarian society, there is an emphasis on the family unit. 4. The community works together and every person has a role that supports the other roles of the community. 5th one, there are also power structures and various social roles within the agrarian economy. Now, let us understand what we understand by agrarian society. The word agrarian means agriculture related and the society whose economy depends on the production of the food crops and farmlands. An agrarian society, how much the nation's populations depends on agriculture economically also define an agrarian society. It is not that in this society all people engage themselves in agricultural practices, but majority it is practiced and stressed upon, while other means of livelihood exist too. These societies trace their origin back to the time of hunters and gatherers, which then shifted into the industrial societies. These societies highly depend on the weather, climate and seasonal factors. Like societies can be broadly divided into tribal societies, agrarian society and industrial society. Agrarian society can be defined as a society where a majority of its population derives its income from agriculture and related activities. 3/4 of the world constitutes of agrarian societies. Post-industrial revolution, the countries that are still primarily agrarian are the poorest. Human society earlier constituted of hunter-gatherers. While the reasons are unknown, humans started shifting from hunting gathering to agriculture around 12,000 years ago, which also marked the end of the last ice age and the start of the Holocene epoch. This is known as the Neolithic revolution. Agriculture is believed to have first begun in the Fertile Crescent, which extends from Iraq to Egypt. Agriculture allowed people to settle down and form communities, which gave rise to new social structures and forms of human societal organization. The ancient Egyptian civilization, Indian civilization, Chinese civilization and Mayan civilization were all agrarian. The Industrial Revolution has been the next greatest revolution after the Neolithic revolution. Over the past 200 years, many societies have turned into industrial societies and the percentage of world population engaged in agriculture consistently grows smaller as machines replace human effort. Now, let us understand the subsistence agriculture. As you might have choose to eat the produce you grew in your own garden, the first farmers of the world did just that, and that subsistence agriculture as it is called first emerged from the transition from hunting and gathering around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago to settled agriculture. This taming of nature or domestication allowed people to settle in one place because now there was a sufficient and reliable food source. Whether the planting and harvesting of wheat in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East or the growing of maize, that is the corn, in the Americas, or the harvesting of rice in the river valleys of eastern China, the first agrarian economies produced food for themselves. Between this agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, agrarian economies did not change significantly, though agrarian societies did become more connected with one another and increased trade. From a basis of subsistence agriculture, agrarian societies might then produce a surplus of goods and thus be able to trade it with neighbors or sell it at a relatively local level. For example, Chinese farmers took rice agriculture and transplanted it in areas of Southeast Asia, and the Roman Empire transferred grain throughout its provinces. Such trade connections expanded as well through the Silk Road across Eurasia and through the maritime trading routes of the Indian Ocean. Despite these many links connecting agrarian economies between the time of the agricultural revolution and modern period, most people still produce primarily for their own consumption rather than for the market. One reason for this is that transportation cost and technological limitations remained barriers to the creation of truly continental or global market for agricultural goods. But all this began to change after 1500 and especially with the Industrial Revolution, Industrial Age and agrarian economies. The first important change in agrarian economies came with the development of new agricultural technologies in the 18th and 19th centuries during the Industrial Revolution. Such technologies allowed the production of larger and larger surpluses. For example, both the cotton gin and the mechanical grain cheaper provided for harvest on a massive scale. New strains of seeds and plants allowed crops to grow more efficiently and in marginal areas. Now, let us sum up. The agrarian question is one of the basic tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, which is associated with the confiscation of all the landed property of the landlords. However, as historical experience shows, because of its class limitations, the bourgeois cannot resolve the agrarian question. The development of class inequality led to usurpation of landed property by the exploiting classes. By the start of the capitalist era, landed property had become concentrated in the hands of feudal land owning class, which exploited the peasants through extraction, and the agrarian economy is an economy that is dependent both on farming and raising of animals. Agrarian economies are less prevalent in modern society. However, they are still needed because there would not be food availability in grocery stores without them. There must be sufficient factors for an agrarian economy to work well. It directs the path of development. Thank you.